So, Andre?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andre de Toy. I'm a professional speaker and radio presenter. You may have listened to my show, The Inspirational Hour of the Big Guy. I speak mostly about politics and economics, and one of the other things that I do is I have a team of speakers that I like to let loose on the public, and one of my best speakers at the moment is Dean. He's been absolutely killing it, telling an incredible story. When the COVID-19 lockdown happened, obviously, and I hear a lot of you are in tourism, like you, Dean and I instantaneously became illegal because we cannot speak to any audience that's over 100 people or over 10 people. And so instantaneously, we pretty much were left without an income and without a job. And if I can encourage you guys, is to say is that we have worked 18 hours a day for the last 3 or 4 weeks, looking for alternatives, looking for things that you would never have imagined that we would have done in the past, but managed to find a way where we can get our message out. And so if I can encourage you to say that this really is a COVID lockdown initiative that we've grabbed to see if we can inform, educate, and entertain the rest of you. So be encouraged. You're in for a real special treat. Dr. Dean Allen is a phenomenal speaker and storyteller, and I think you're going to find your time is well spent. One of the things I just quickly wanted to say to you is that this meeting is being recorded. We'll skip everything up until now. So if you are wanted by the police or by the creditors, or you haven't paid your maintenance, this will be a good time for you to turn off your camera. Really, honestly, I don't think it really makes any difference and stuff, but if you really feel it you don't want to be filmed, that's up to you. The other thing is that if your internet connection is spotty, the only thing which we can do to help you there is for you to turn off your camera. So if you're having an absolutely great quality and you're running good fiber lines, this should be no problem for you. And you guys can run your cameras on if you want. It doesn't make any difference. We will, however, turn off and mute you when the presentation starts. Obviously, that's just out of respect for Dean and for his presentation, and also for the recording to make sure that it's nice. We simultaneously also switch off the chat line, because what the chat line does is that it pops up the whole time over the screen, and it's quite annoying while you're doing the presentation for somebody to say, hi, Dean, or whatever. And here's the interesting part about technology. 3 or 4 weeks ago, we would not have been able to do this. I definitely wouldn't have been able to do this. And fortunately for us, we have met Terry, who runs a company called Medita Concepts. If any of you are wanting to do large-scale productions, we now can do pretty much anything that you want. We've done several of these now, and into the several hundreds. And what Terry is doing, so I find it fascinating that Dean is sitting in the wilderness on a mobile phone, and Terry is sitting in Kenilworth on her high-speed lines and running the presentation, and I'm sitting in Pinelands and I'm doing the emceeing, and all of you are scattered around the world. So what a different place it's become, and how exciting isn't this that we can actually still carry on doing these things. All right, the other thing I wanted to say to you is that we have a huge special guest here today, Murray Gardner, the CEO of Gilt Edge. Murray, thank you very much. You're the person who's made all these things happen. And if I could just ask Murray to say a few words. Terry, if you could just highlight him.
Thanks very much, Andre. I don't think I made it happen. I think you guys, yourself and Dean, made it happen, and so thanks for that. Yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for their time this afternoon, this morning, depending where you are in the world. I know everybody's inundated by webinars, so thank you for taking the time to join our one today. I think it's certainly going to be one with a difference. Dean and I go back 3 years. I attended a 50th birthday party in Matjiesfontein, which is a small little town about 3 hours from Cape Town, and Dean did an incredible talk there, and I was really fascinated and interested by it. And then we had our staff get together there about 6 months later, and I definitely had to invite Dean back to tell the story, which he did again. And since then, we've become good friends. And then he mentioned he would love to do this talk for us today, and I grabbed it with 2 hands, as I knew it would be interesting. So sit back, enjoy the next hour. And Dean, thanks so much for your time and also for your support over the years. We will look forward to the next hour. Thank you. And back to Andre.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks, Murray. I just want to say is that I haven't had the good fortune of knowing Dean for that long. I heard of him and saw him, and then I managed to get him on my radio show. And, you know, there are interviews and there are interviews. And one of the interviews that I'm keeping for posterity is the one that I did with Dean. It was just such a brilliant interview. He's a natural speaker and a natural storyteller. And when I did the interview, I advertised him as follows. I said, when you hear his voice, you know he's not from South Africa. But when you hear his heart, then you know he's absolutely South African. He's got a doctorate in history from Stellenbosch University as well. The Engelsman went to Stellenbosch University, managed to get his doctorate there. He's written an amazing book called Empire, War and Cricket, which for any of you that are writers or know a little bit about writing, has sold over 10,000 copies in this country, which makes it pretty much, in my mind, a bestseller. Ladies and gentlemen, if I can welcome Dr. Dean Allen.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Murray, for that kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me. These are unprecedented times, of course. We're all sitting at home and we're trying to gather information about what's actually happening at the moment. So what I decided to do, as Andre said, I'm a trained historian, was to actually help people and to gather information and to make comparisons with the past. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. But before I go any further, a little bit about me. You can hear that I haven't got a typical South African accent, as Andre said. I'm originally from the West Country of England, a little village there I grew up in. And I came to South Africa for the first time in the mid-90s. Travel is part of all of our lives, I'm sure, on this call. I mean, a lot of you are in the travel industry, of course, and it became a passion for me to see different parts of the world. But it was through somebody I met. I actually met a South African lady back there in England. She was a dentist. Her name was Van der Merwe, and she was working for the NHS. And I met her at a gym, would you believe, and we got chatting, and she was the person that brought me to South Africa for the first time. Now, our love affair fizzled out, unfortunately, but my love affair with South Africa continued. But she saw something in me. She said, Dean, why don't you go to university? So there I was at the age of 27, giving up that safe office job, and I started a new career, which has led me to speak to you today. I went on to do a master's and a PhD through Stellenbosch University. And as I said, my love affair with South Africa is still here. And I've met many incredible people on this journey. And people like Murray and Andre, I've engaged with over recent times. But as I said, this is now a time to come together and spread positivity, I believe, and clear, honest information. So that's what I'm going to do today. We decided a few weeks ago when we were thinking about a contribution. As a historian, as I said, I normally talk about sport and the British Empire and things like that. And this book here, you can see behind me, is called Empire, War and Cricket. Now that has probably made me famous in South Africa to a certain extent. It sold over 10,000 copies. And yes, it's the story of Matjiesfontein, which Murray, and I know, and his staff has enjoyed in the past. But now I want to talk about something perhaps more serious, something that we can use today. I'm going to look at lessons from history, we call it, to actually inform us where we are today in this current coronavirus crisis. Because as you will see in the next 40 minutes or so, this is something we have actually encountered before as mankind. We have come through challenges like this, and we will come through again. Now, I realize that most of you are in the tourism industry, and my sympathies are with you because indirectly, I'm also connected to tourism. I rely on visitors that come to South Africa to listen to my stories and create an audience. So we are all going to be affected by this in the months to come. And I believe it's how we deal with the information now and how we actually come through that. And we're also going to be developing a talk, our next one, more about the economic situation, and more of that at the end, because we're going to look at how the world has come through various crises in terms of economic depressions. And I think that's important as well to think about. But today we're going to focus on the pandemics that the world has faced, because now, as I know, as you know, this is an unprecedented time for us. So Terry is down there in Cape Town. I'm in Wilderness, that beautiful part of the garden route, but I'm actually speaking to you through my cell phone. So I cannot see your faces, which is quite unusual for me as a public speaker. Normally, I thrive on the energy of the people in the audience, but now I just hope you're with me and you're enjoying what I'm going to say. So Terry is going to control the slides. So we could go to the first one, please. As I said, we decided that we were going to come together and create a series of lectures that are going to teach us things from history. So the most obvious one for us to start with is this idea of learning from the great pandemics that happened before. Because I said, this is not the first time that the world has been faced with such a crisis. And I believe history certainly, and historians like myself and storytellers have a really important role to play. In fact, Rudyard Kipling, I'm sure you've heard of him, once said that we all remember our history if it was told in the form of stories. And that's exactly what I'm going to do today. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm just going to explain what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes or so. First of all, I'm going to look at those global pandemics through history, things like the Black Death and smallpox and all these horrific sounding diseases, but I'm going to put them into context for you. We're going to look in detail at what happened 100 years ago. Now, you've probably heard of the Spanish flu and what was happening 100 years ago. In fact, a lot of the information we are gathering, as I will show you, comes from that period and how we actually recovered from that crisis. We're going to look at today. What are the comparisons with where we sit today? Here, wherever you're watching this presentation from around the world, we can learn from the past. And it's that learning from history that I hold so dear. And thank you so much for your time today. So I hope you can actually get something from that as well. And I'm going to end with some good news. I believe there is a positive aspect to this. I know we are sitting there, a lot of us alone. We're missing our family connections. We're missing our social life. We just want to go out and get back to work, don't we? But there is good news. And I do believe that there is a future and we can actually work together to actually make the future a bright one. But we have to understand the lessons and to be careful from the lessons that history has actually told us. And that's what I'm going to show you now. Because if we can go to the global pandemics through history, I'm going to start as early as the 14th century. You can see the date there, 1334. That was the Great Plague of London. It was known as the Black Death. You may have heard of it. Sounds gruesome, doesn't it? Well, that actually began in China. But like today, it was also caused by people traveling across continents. Now, we're involved in travel, of course, and we know that there's a relation with people traveling, and that's why travel has been locked down in many parts of the world as we speak. Well, then it was due to merchants returning from the Far East, the old Silk Route, as they called it, and then from China bringing back to Europe, they inadvertently brought a virus that would go on to cause 25 million deaths in Europe alone. 125 million people died from the Black Death. Now, let's think about that. Let's put that into context. You know that this actually lasted for 30 years. And doing research for this talk, I come up with some wonderful snippets of information. Do you know that ships returning from China during the Great Plague period, they actually were held in their ports for 40 days? That's right, 40 days of quarantine. Now, I'm not a linguist, but some of you might know Italian. Do you know that the word for 40 is 40, which is where the word quarantine comes from, which is quite interesting, isn't it? If we go forward now to 1519, we have the smallpox. Now, the smallpox was also caused by traveling between continents. Then it was brought by explorers to the area we now know as Mexico. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mexico in terms of tourism later in the presentation. But at this stage, it was brought by explorers traveling around the world. That virus, the smallpox virus in 1519, killed 25% of the native population of Mexico as we know it today. And in fact, 100 years later, that same disease was brought by European settlers to North America. Inadvertently, 20 million North American Indians perished as a result of smallpox. So let's put that into some kind of context with the figures we're facing today. Fast forward to 1918, and that's what we're going to be talking about now in more detail. The Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed 50 million people in the 2 years that it was prevalent. To date, ladies and gentlemen, it remains the world's worst natural disaster. In fact, over a quarter of the world's population was infected at one time or another by Spanish flu. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Now, when I was thinking about making comparisons with other crises we face in mankind, how could we ignore something like HIV/AIDS? In fact, it's a pandemic we are still dealing with today. And as recently as 1984, we didn't even know what HIV/AIDS was. Then the cause was unknown. We know in the mid-80s that it was discovered, but it went on to kill 25 million people to date. So it's still something we are actually dealing with. If we fast forward then to the severe acute respiratory syndrome of 2003, SARS as it was known. As you know, it received a lot of attention in the media. This also began in China. There's the comparison. Another comparison, though, is, do you know that SARS is a form of coronavirus, very similar to the virus that we're facing today? 8,000 cases were reported and 774 deaths. If we come a bit further in that decade, though, perhaps the most significant certainly in terms of the significance to tourism, as you'll probably remember, was swine flu. Now, swine flu, the first outbreak, took place in the United States. Officially, 18,000 people lost their lives as a result of swine flu, but scientists actually argue that it could be up to 575,000 people. Now, that is an epidemic that we were facing just over a decade ago. We came through swine flu, we came through SARS, we've beaten things such as the Spanish flu, so yes, we will get through the current coronavirus, and that is the message I want you to take from today. We have faced challenges in the past, and we will come through this current crisis. But where did the 1918 Spanish flu that I'm going to be talk about now, where did it start? Well, we have to go back to look at society at the time. In 1918, the world was gripped by the greatest war of all time. It was called the Great War for a reason. It was the first major mechanized war. 9 million soldiers and lost their lives in the First World War, and 21 million were injured in that conflict. Not to mention the refugees and the malnutrition and the great displacement that was caused due to this war. Now, where did the Spanish flu first break out? Well, would you believe it was in the United States? It was something that Donald Trump would not like to admit to, but yes, the Americans had the first case of the Spanish flu. And that happened on the 4th of March at a place called Funston in Kansas. And if we can look at the screen here, we can see the hospital shortly after the outbreak. It was a military camp, you see. Now, soldiers just about preparing to go to Europe for the war were starting to develop flu-like symptoms there in March 1918. Things like coughs, fever, respiratory problems. But before the authorities realized that this was no ordinary flu, those soldiers had already left for the war in Europe, thereby spreading one of the greatest viruses the world has ever seen. So before we know it, it is now gripped the civilian population. So again, it was caused by travel between continents. If we can see on this next screen, during my research, I came up with some incredible images. This scene here is from the streets of Seattle in the United States. You can see the police officers with their makeshift masks, the same kind of mask we are relying on today. You see that this was something different. People could die from the Spanish flu virus within 24 hours of contracting the first signs of this disease. 24 hours. It was a particularly deadly disease. But we also understand that it was left to the individual countries and individual cities and towns to control it in the best way they could. Seattle, as you can see here, they took control of it very quickly, and I'll explain why that was significant in a minute. But it was left again to our emergency services, our medical staff, to pick up the pieces. And as you can see here, the medical services were absolutely overrun in 1918. The world was at war, remember. But if I can just put it into some kind of context again, more people died of the Spanish flu in the first 25 weeks than have died from HIV/AIDS in 25 years. This was a pandemic that, as I said, the human race had never seen on this scale. Up to 100 million people, scientists now say, were actually killed by the Spanish flu. And we're talking only 100 years ago. So that's why it's so important for me to make this presentation to you today. You see, we can learn so much from that period. Now, the war was the key to spreading this disease. Perhaps now we can blame tourists, we can blame business travel, people traveling between continents, but undoubtedly it was the war that spread this disease so quickly at that time. And I have a wonderful video here from San Francisco in 1918 for you to see the effects of what was happening.
And the war is over. Into Market Street pour the men and women of the city to celebrate. Up and down the street they parade, delirious with joy. For some of them have come to know the meaning of war. Grotesque and ugly in their influenza masks, the people of San Francisco celebrate. You've seen the signs they carry. Kaiser Wilhelm is Sweet William now. Who's afraid of the Huns? Some of them signs of hate, most of them just outpourings of a great joy. For this day, November 11th, 1918, marks the end of an era of hate and bloodshed and violence. It's the beginning of peace and goodwill on earth. And those who have died have not died in vain. They've died to make the world safe for democracy. They've swept to victory in the war to end war. And so San Francisco celebrates in 1918 because the war is over and there'll never be another.
Incredible images there from the streets of San Francisco. Unfortunately, we know that that wasn't the war to end all wars, because the Second World War was on the horizon. But what we do know is that different cities, certainly in the United States and around the world, were handling this in different ways. I showed you a scene from Seattle earlier. In Seattle, they banned the homecoming parade that they were showing there in San Francisco, and therefore they got hold of this infection. You see, social isolation and large gatherings were quickly understood to be important parts of controlling this particular virus, as it is today. So if we look at San Francisco, you can see people wearing their masks. How about if you compare that with a place like Philadelphia? They went ahead with their homecoming parade, and within 6 weeks of that happening, 14,000 people had actually lost their lives in Philadelphia. So I can't stress that enough. It's so important that we respect what the authorities and what our governments are telling us. If we go back too early, if we have those large gatherings again, we are going to experience perhaps a second and third wave. And talking about the waves, you can see here on the left, this is a graph from 1918 and 1990. You can see that there are various peaks, but there are also other spikes. And yes, if we go back too soon, we're going to experience, like they did in 1918, a second and a third wave. In fact, the third wave was quite destructive, and it came as late as the spring of 1919 in America. Now, we are relying on information, talks like this perhaps, to keep us informed. Then it was the media, it was newspapers. As you can see, this newspaper headline in this daily in Minnesota: public places are ordered closed. At the same time, they're reporting news from the front in the First World War. You see, we now rely on TV and internet, so we're in a much better place than they were back then. So news and the spread of information, and of course, we need to be critical of the information that we're actually consuming, is so important even today. Now, when I was looking at images, I had to include this. Now, we've all got our own techniques of how we're going to deal with this. This wonderful image from a family in America there. And if we look closer, they're clearly taking the threat of the Spanish flu very seriously. But if we look closer, the family pet, Tigger there, the cat, has also got its own protective mask. Absolutely wonderful. So I hope that this family survives the threat of the virus in 1918, that's for sure. And some incredible images have emerged. This lady, for example, she's using a filter system. Perhaps this will be marketed now as we come out of lockdown. She's breathing clean air through a filter system, as you can see. Well, I hope that her investment was worth it, and she actually survived the epidemic of 1918. But you're probably wondering, one of the questions that I'm asked often is, Dean, why was it called the Spanish flu? And I'll come to that now. And that is significant, I think, for us in the tourism industry. Because if we give a label to a country, can you imagine the effect that is going to have on the tourism in that country? And I believe that is why, like in 1918, countries like America, Britain, etc., are so keen to label this as the Chinese virus. And just talking about tourism, we know how hard hit Spain has been, and Italy, and places like that. So how is that going to affect the tourism in the months and years to come? Quite severely. We can go to the next slide, please. If I could just ask you to mute your mics, please. I'm just picking up some interference in the background. Now, this particular sign here, as you can see, Spanish influenza. Why was it called the Spanish flu? In this particular sign, it says Spanish flu has endangered the prosecution of war in Europe. There are 1,500 cases in this particular Navy Yard alone, 30 deaths. Spitting spreads the Spanish flu, don't spit. Well, we know now that our own personal hygiene, our interaction, the fact that we can catch this disease through infected surfaces and through touching each other, we know that. And this comes from this period. But why the Spanish flu? Well, this is the key period, and I think we can actually take something from it in terms of tourism. The Americans and the British were so keen not to be labelled with this pandemic that they looked to a country like Spain back in 1918. And why did they do that? Well, Spain was actually neutral in the First World War. So Spain was inadvertently reporting cases of this pandemic freely in their press, as we can see from this headline. This is a headline in the Spanish news agency in 1918. It says a strange form of disease of epidemic character has appeared in Madrid. The epidemic is of a mild nature, no deaths reported. Well, I can tell you this, within 2 weeks of that notice appearing, 100,000 Spaniards have been infected by this pandemic. But by the time they realized how serious this was, the rest of the world was labeling this the Spanish flu. Can you imagine if Spain had an established tourism industry at the time, how that would have affected them in a negative way? Interestingly enough, the Spanish did not call it the Spanish flu. They called it the French flu because they blamed the French for spreading it to Spain. Isn't that fascinating? If we can go to the next slide, please. South Africa is a case I want to feature on now. You probably heard, because I'm sitting here in South Africa and a lot of our audience is from South Africa, that South Africa was particularly affected in 1918. And yes, it was. It was actually the 5th worst hit country in the world. And it won't surprise you to learn that it was actually caused, again, by returning troops from World War I. So these lads who had served in those awful trenches, had faced the horrors of mustard gas, were now returning to their friends and family, but they were bringing home one of the deadliest viruses the world had ever seen. So the ships that docked in Cape Town and Durban were bringing home this virus, and it would spread throughout the country like wildfire. In fact, the first case was on the 13th of September 1918 in Durban. A week later, the first case was experienced in Cape Town. But by the time the authorities realized that they had to impose a stricter quarantine, the troops would leave the ship without showing any symptoms. After 3 days, that's all the quarantine period was. They would get on the extensive rail network that we were lucky to have in South Africa at that time, and they would travel throughout the interior, taking this disease to places like Kimberley and Johannesburg and places that had never experienced this before. It was also spread by the migrant labor system. That's right, the miners who were living in close proximity and were moving between different sites of work. They were also spreading this disease. And that's why the government today in South Africa are so keen to make sure that these large gatherings of people is avoided, so that this spread of disease can actually be contained. If we look back at 1918, look at these figures. Within 6 weeks, there were 300,000 deaths alone here in South Africa. It was known as Black October. The lack of information, the poor individual health, the poor sanitation and healthcare led to a pandemic. 500,000 people lost their lives in South Africa as a result of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So let's just put that into context with how we have dealt with it today. Cyril Ramaphosa and his government, I believe, have acted quickly and swiftly in getting this under control, at least to this point, because this is what we could face. Up to now, we are still around the 100 deaths mark, which is quite remarkable. Now, if we return to a sense of normality, if we forget about self-isolation, if we return to those large public gatherings, especially in our townships and areas like that, there will be an incredible second wave of this pandemic, which will actually be far worse than the first wave. Now, South Africa was the 5th worst hit back in 1918. Which country had the unfortunate title of the #1 worst affected? That was India. India had up to 18 million deaths. We can probably make comparisons with what's happened in South Africa. People were living in poverty, they were living close together. But the lack of information in India, the poor colonial rule at the time, highlighted the lack of healthcare, lack of infrastructure. And if you can see here, the information that people were fed. This is a headline from the Times of India at the time. The main remedy is to go to bed and not to worry. Well, unfortunately, that was not good enough. Just by going to bed and not worrying led to absolute millions of deaths. And we can see from this horrific picture here, corpses were actually buried or burnt within the streets because people could not handle the amount of destruction that was being caused. It led to an economic disaster, of course. Factories, food production was shut down as people fled cities trying to avoid this. India is quite a stark case and something we should look at in terms of a warning for today. But where do we go with this next? I want to think about how we came out of this. Now, eventually we did, of course. This pandemic lasted for 2 years, but people's knowledge, as it is now, improved. As you can see from these notices, people realized that things like spitting, coughing, sneezing was spreading this disease like the common flu. We can see on the left that it was actually regarded as dangerous as poison gas within the First World War. In fact, the fact that the Spanish flu was actually affecting the capability of war of countries to go to war meant that the governments had to deal with this as seriously as it did with its war effort. But eventually we did come through this, and we did get through that. I mean, it would lead, of course, to years of economic hardship, and I will explain more of that in my next talk, which is about the economic situation. I mean, the world was facing an economic depression in the late 90s, perhaps linked to what was happening post First World War and Spanish flu. But I think we rely on our leaders now for clear information, and that's what I would just want to point out here. Did you know that back in 2005, George W. Bush, none other than the George W. Bush, President of America, had an absolute obsession with the Spanish flu. He read a book, and he realized that this could be one of the most dangerous threats to his country. In fact, he said, if we wait for a pandemic to appear, it will be too late to prepare. Back then, George Bush put together a national strategic plan for pandemics. He called it the Bush Plan. He put aside billions of dollars for this plan. Now, if we fast forward to the swine flu and the era of Barack Obama, Obama also agreed with Bush here. They may have come from different political spheres, but they agreed on one thing: the threat to the world through pandemics such as the one we're facing today. Obama, in fact, maintained this strategy, and within 11 days of the swine flu outbreak in America, had made an effective plan and dealt with that particular crisis. Now, if we fast forward to today, we know that the president of the United States is not taking the same line. Yes, Donald Trump, who was keen to call this the Chinese virus, we know has set aside any previous planning. In fact, he is giving the responsibility to individual cities and states, that same responsibility that they took back in 1918, and some of those cities and states did not act responsibly. In fact, we've just seen only this week that Georgia has allowed hair salons and tattoo parlors to open again. Now, if you think that's sensible and you think that's the way forward, I just hope that Donald Trump's administration is not going to regret letting people go back to normality too soon. I certainly think that George W. Bush would have acted in a different way according to his own plan. Now, if you can just come back to me for a minute, Terry. I'd just like to make sure that you're still with me, because what I'm going to do now is the key to this talk. I'm going to look at differences between the COVID-19 virus and the Spanish and the Spanish flu of 1918. I'm also going to look at similarities, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about how a pandemic such as this has affected the tourism industry in the past, and also look at a case study for you, if I may. So we can just go back to the next slide, please, Terry. I'm going to look at the similarities first of all. Now, the first similarity we can look at is the fact that both the COVID-19 and the Spanish flu were what we call novel viruses or novel viruses. In fact, they are new viruses. There is no immunity and no vaccines. I hope sincerely that our scientists are actually finding a vaccine as we speak, but that is a main comparison. The next similarity is the fact that both were spread globally. They are both global pandemics. Then the spread was through soldiers returning through the war, through refugees dispersed throughout the world. Now, perhaps, the spread was caused by tourists. Yes, people traveling for business and leisure. And that's why our industry has been hit so hard. And perhaps that is why our industry is going to be one of the hardest things to turn around, because yes, it was due to people traveling between continents, between states, and that is a major similarity. The next similarity is, of course, is in the way we control this. We look at 1918. They used things such as isolation, quarantine, disinfectants. The fact that we know that it spread through infected surfaces, for example. The fact we're told to wash our hands. They quickly understood that in 1918 as well. But also the fact that they banned public gatherings. So while we're so keen to get back to our concerts and our cinemas and into our crowded restaurants and pubs, we've got to remember that if we go back too soon, this could cause another outbreak of this pandemic. And the personal protection equipment, as you saw from those wonderful scenes in Seattle in 1918, we are still using a similar form of protection in terms of gloves and masks. So that worked then, and we're hoping it's going to work now as well. The next similarity is the fact they were both animal sources. Back in 1918, it was spread, argued by scientists, it was actually derived from either pigs or birds. There's an argument for each of those cases. but in the current situation, I'm sure you've all seen those horrific scenes from those live animal markets in China. We don't really know where this came from, but we do know that it was an animal source and it did come from China. Another similarity involves China. I've mentioned that the Spanish flu originated in America. Well, the Americans, it won't surprise you, are very keen to actually dispel that label. In fact, an article in 2014 in National Geographic actually argued that the Spanish flu was spread by Chinese migrants actually coming across to Canada and traveling south to work in North America. So as Trump was doing in those early days of this pandemic, trying to call it the Chinese virus, again, perhaps there is a link. But as you can imagine, with people in our industry trying to sell a destination, how destructive is it to actually have your name linked to a pandemic? And the final similarity I want to look at here is information control. Now, we are now relying on our governments. As I said, which we all tune in here in South Africa to the weekly address by Cyril Ramaphosa. We are looking for clear, direct leadership, which I think he has actually displayed, him and his government. He's taking clear advice, informed advice, and we're actually moving forward as a nation. The media has an important part to play. I don't know about you, but I don't like to watch too much news. There can be too much negative news. I think the fact that you've joined us today for this positive exercise in spreading and sharing information is a good thing. But national prestige is a key to this. I think certainly in terms of the tourism industry. You see, countries even today do not want to show the true figures. They don't want to show they are a hotspot for this particular pandemic. Can you only imagine the impact on the tourism industry in Italy, for example, when we actually go back to some form of normality? Italy and Spain, countries that were in the news for having the greatest number of deaths. And what about Great Britain? Britain probably ignored the warning of other countries, was slow to react, and recently had recorded the highest number of deaths of any country in Europe in one single day. So think about that in terms of prestige. And maybe we will also experience a second wave, and that is a similarity with what was happening in 1918. And I hope that that doesn't come to pass. And that's part of sharing this information. But the good news is there are many differences as well. The main difference you probably heard is the fact that the Spanish flu affected the younger age group. In fact, 66% of all deaths were in the 18 to 45 year category. Now, that's for many reasons. Most people in that age category were affected by the First World War. They were either fighting or through disease or malnutrition. But an interesting fact is that the elderly population in 1918 were not so affected because they had survived what was known as the Russian flu, which occurred in 1890. The Russian flu had killed 1 million people, and there's a train of thought by scientists that will suggest that the elderly population back in 1918 had built up some form of immunity. And that's perhaps what they're trying to encourage us to do now. Throughout the world, build up immunity to this virus. And we know that that people get the current coronavirus and they actually survive and they go on to live a normal life. But now it is our elderly population, those that are weak, perhaps suffering from existing conditions that a particular virus affects. So the age group was a major difference. The next difference I identified was the incubation period. Can you imagine a virus that would actually kill you within 24 hours? That's what was happening with the Spanish flu. Thankfully, the coronavirus is not so evil in the way it actually affects people. Yes, we can carry this around without showing any symptoms. We can actually take 2 weeks for the first symptoms to show, which is fine, but it also provides a problem with identifying who is infected. And that's why it's important to maintain self-isolation and social distancing. Social distancing is the key to this. The next difference is this one, the fatality rate. Thankfully, this is a major difference. Up to 5% of the people infected by the Spanish flu lost their lives. The figures we can see today, despite all the unnecessary deaths and the tragedy that is happening, the figures are nowhere near that scale. The United States has just passed 50,000 deaths, which is far too many, of course, but certainly not 5% of those infected. So that is something to keep in mind. The next difference is medical knowledge. Now, this is our main comfort to me. Of course, we are 100 years advanced. We know our science and our treatment techniques are far more advanced in 2020 than they were back in the days of the Spanish flu. In fact, in 1918, they didn't even know what penicillin was. It hadn't been invented. Now, penicillin doesn't cure this pandemic, but it helps with those secondary infections, of course. So we are in a far better and stronger place, ladies and gentlemen, to actually deal with this. And I believe that is the main comfort. And the point I just want to make here at the end is this, that we have faced far more difficulties than this in terms of a pandemic. The tools of communication, for example, we now are in a far more better position. They didn't have internet in 1918. I mean, they didn't have the TV. You couldn't tune into somebody like me and actually get information like this. So we are now in a far better position. And I want you to remember that. Think about the pandemics that I talked about in the past. Here in 2020, as a global community, we can deal with this in an informed way by learning from what's happened in the past and using the scientific techniques. And if I can just show you this quote from the president of the Center for the History of Medicine, Howard Markle. He says, we are in a much better place to handle this pandemic than we were 100 years ago. And I believe that is the case. Now, if you can just come back to me, Terry, for a second. When I approached Murray about giving this presentation, of course, I understood the difficulties in which he was in the tourism industry, and a lot of you are. A lot of you are, you're involved in hotels, you're involved in travel agencies, etc. And I didn't want to paint too stark of a picture, but I do really commiserate, and I understand that the tourism industry was probably the first and will be one of the hardest hit sectors. But I wanted to get some information from the past, because the tourism industry has faced difficulties like this in the past. We have faced economic depressions and world crisis in terms of financial situations. But do you remember the swine flu? That affected certainly parts of the world harder than we'd experienced in terms of tourism. So if we can go back to the slide, I just wanted to look at this particular case study. If you remember back to 2009, when swine flu broke out, it was an absolute tragedy for places like Mexico and the United States. And because Mexico in particular was seen as a hotbed for this virus, the swine flu, its tourism industry was decimated. But as you know, Mexico now is probably one of the success stories of recent years. It managed to rebuild not only its reputation, but also its infrastructure and its tourism industry to actually come through this. And we're talking only a decade on. So that, I hope, is some comfort. And I looked into the reasons behind that. And of course, they are wide ranging. I can't go into too much detail. But the first thing I want to mention, it won't surprise you that in America and the United States especially, which were worse affected in terms of tourism, that there were tax breaks offered. Now the financial implications, of course, is massive. But the governments understood how important the tourism industry was to those particular countries. So they offered tax breaks for hotels, airlines, restaurants, people affected by this downturn in tourism. In fact, the government supported a very aggressive and a proactive tourism marketing campaign. So if you remember in those days, Mexico was everywhere when they were trying to rebuild, and that was sponsored by government money. It was a case of building consumer confidence in the product again, in the destination. And that needed a coordinated plan between the stakeholders, between the airlines, the hotels, between the travel agencies, between the government as well. And that's the key thing here, of course. This will take a lot of money. It involved education for the tourism sector. It's all very well us selling tours and going back to some sense of normality if we don't understand the fears of people. We are trying now to encourage people to come back to South Africa. We will be in the coming months. And I hope you'll agree that the stance of our government and the fact that the figures that have come out of South Africa so far will actually help us in the long term. Now imagine trying to drive tourism in a place like Italy after this current crisis. That's going to be a tough job. So we need to be educated within the tourism sector to understand how this affects our market. Now you see this flu-free guarantee, quite difficult to say, but that was offered. You see the stakeholders within Mexico and the United States offered a flu-free guarantee. In other words, if you came back and enjoyed our destinations, enjoyed these wonderful beaches and our resorts, we will offer you a guarantee that this is a flu-free destination. So it goes beyond whatever's covered in travel insurance. This now is to increase people's confidence in the market. And unfortunately, that is reflected in price. We know, and we're doing it now. I'm giving this presentation for free. We have to go back and offer something. And that involves price incentives. And we know that in Mexico and the United States, in the post-swine flu world, that their offers were quite incredible. They encouraged people to come back, and they will return, ladies and gentlemen. People love to travel. It's part of one of the joys of the modern world, and travel will return. So we've just got to think about the longer term and how we're going to actually deal with that. Now, as I sum up, I just want to go through my main points from this presentation. And as I said, we've called it learning lessons from history. The first thing I want to point out is that the Spanish flu killed more people than World War I, more people than the Great War. We are not at anywhere near those figures at the moment. The next thing I would like to point out is that we should learn from the mistakes of 1918. Social distancing is imperative to beating this. We learned that from then. We saw a second and third wave, so we should maintain the social distancing. It means that perhaps in the months and perhaps even year to come within tourism, it's going to be part of our practice. It's going to be part of what we do. The fact that social distancing will be so important. The next point I would like to just leave you with, these viruses affect everyone. They affect everyone, regardless of our status, our wealth, our ethnic background. Back in 1918, did you know that Gandhi had the Spanish flu? Lloyd George, Franklin D. Roosevelt, even Walt Disney was affected by the Spanish flu. We've seen recently the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, was in intensive care. So we should respect this virus. It doesn't respect us, so we should respect it. It literally can affect all of us. The next thing I just want to mention here is don't make this political. We require serious leadership at the moment, don't we? The fact that we are all gathered together here, we're doing something proactive. If we look at leaders like Donald Trump, perhaps even Boris Johnson, they may be reacting a little late to what science and history is teaching them. Here in South Africa, thankfully, we acted early. We received news of a lockdown before this pandemic could take hold. But I will warn you this, our greatest challenges lay ahead. If we go back to some sense of normality, if society just goes back to large gatherings, we could face the biggest challenges to date. But to date, we do need strong leadership. And as you could see, back in 2005, even someone like George W. Bush had a plan in place in which to actually cope with this in the future. The next point, and this is the key point, we have survived, ladies and gentlemen, as mankind, far worse pandemics than the one we are currently facing. Yes, it is not pleasant. It has changed the way we actually live and exist on a day-to-day basis, but it will end. And as you can see, people lived through 2 world wars. They lived through the Black Death. They survived the Spanish flu of 1918. We will come through this. And I think that is the message I want to leave today. And I want to leave you with this wonderful story. You probably have heard of a man in Great Britain. Now, these wonderful stories that are going around on social media. This lovely gentleman is turning 100 at the end of the month. His name is Captain Tom Moore. He's a veteran of the Second World War. He decided to walk 100 laps of his care home to raise £1,000 for the National Health Service. I'll let you see the video.
And here he comes. Captain Tom Moore, approaching his 100th birthday, 100 laps of his garden during lockdown, all of the money going to NHS charities, a guard of honour from the 1st Battalion, the Yorkshire Regiment. Inches to go, and there he is. Congratulations. Well done. Absolutely amazing, amazing achievement. Captain Tom, how do you feel this morning?
Fine. I mean, yes. I mean, I'm surrounded by the right sort of people, so yes, I feel fine. I hope you're all feeling fine too.
Well, we are feeling much more fine. I think we've all been inspired. The whole country, it seems like the whole world has been inspired by your achievement.
Oh, thank you.
Really great to see you this morning.
What a wonderful story. Let me tell you that Captain Tom Moore has not raised £1,000 for the National Health Service in the UK. He's raised £28 million. What an inspiration to us all. He's put his mind to it, a veteran of the Second World War, and he certainly did his part. And I think that is a story that could inspire us. And I think we should take the positives out of what is happening today. Now, I'm not a royalist, but I did see this wonderful presentation by the Queen. She actually, in the United Kingdom, she actually broke with protocol, and she addressed the world a couple of weeks ago. And what she said, in a common endeavour, at a time, this time we join with all nations across the globe in a common endeavour, using great advances of science and our instinctive compassion to heal. We will succeed, and that success will belong to every one of us. And I think that is a key point, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon. We all have responsibility, don't we, to deal with this. I know we're worried about our families and we're worried about our business, but this is something that we will actually deal with. And to leave you with the final slide, I just wanted to think about what we could actually do to make a contribution. And so what we've decided to do is go beyond the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and look at actually lessons from history in terms of recovering from the different crises in terms of the economic situation. The world got through the 1929 depression. It got through the crisis following the Second World War. In terms of more recent crises, the Asia financial crisis of the 2000s. We did get through that, and there are certain patterns we can learn from history, and we can certainly learn from those patterns in terms of tourism. I hope my example from Mexico and the United States, as recently as 2009 with the swine flu epidemic, gave you some kind of comfort. Yes, we will rely on our governments, of course, and that is a big ask, but we also must come together as an industry, because we're all in this together, to actually build for a future, which I believe will be bright, and we will come through this. Thank you so much for your time. Back to you, Andre.
Dr. Dean, as usual, you never fail to amaze me. Every single time I listen to this presentation, it's just a little information. And Dean, I think it's outstanding. Can I just quickly ask you guys that the recording will end at this point? If you could turn your cameras on, just one or two things we're going to be doing quickly. The one is to say thank you to Dean. And for those of you that haven't said thank you electronically, if you click on your gallery view so that you can see everybody, one of the things that we do is we say thank you like this. We applaud using the waving fingers, and it's something very nice. Dean, I just wanted you to show you that everyone loved your presentation. I think it's amazing, and I'm hoping that they've found the encouragement that you were trying to spread in there. So that's amazing. Thank you, guys. That's absolutely great. The other thing I also wanted you to do, if you just